Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weeb Union, and in this one we start out in the direction of Vuhledar, where the Russians have managed to gain access closer to the fortified positions of the Ukrainians. The Russians have already breached the road in between Konstantinivka and Vuhledar in two areas, isolating the fortified position. Ahead of storming it, we're currently seeing positional fighting on the outskirts of it, which indicates that the Russians have started an operation to take control over the fortified position. Taking control of it would allow the Russians to start pushing towards Vuhledar, down south towards Vuhledar, and up north towards Konstantinivka. As we see in the Konstantinivka direction, we also see positional fighting north of Pokrovsk, where the Russians are trying to move closer to gain better access to the fortified positions of the Ukrainians just north of Konstantinivka. We've managed to gain control over several forest lines and fields northeast of Konstantinivka. So we see the Russians are doing positional fighting across the entirety of this road between Pobeda and Vuhledar, where the objective is to gain control over as much of it as possible. The fortified positions of the Ukrainians, the towns nearby, ahead of gaining control over towns such as Vuhledar and Konstantinivka. Further north in the direction of the Pokrovsk section of the front line, the Russians have advanced both in the direction of Kalinove and the fortified positions of the Ukrainians near the Karelivka reservoir. The Russians are getting closer and closer towards Karelivka as they continue pushing down in a southern direction. At the same time, the Russians have also pushed here to the east of Mikhailivka, west of Kalinove, gaining control over the fortified positions just northwest of Kalinove. All of these positions between Karelivka in the east and Selidove in the west are all located on the high grounds, all of the fortified positions, and the direction between the Russian positions and the Ukrainian positions just north of Novohrodivka. All of these positions are located on the high ground. The Russians are moving through these high grounds to gain better access to the next lines of defense. The same in the north. Novohrodivka is located on the low ground, as we see in elevation 145 meters. Same with the villages and towns in between Novohrodivka and Novohrodivka. This is why the main push of the Russians is going through Novohrodivka to move along the high ground towards the rear of Novohrodivka, where all of the fortified positions are located, here between Novohrodivka in the east and all the way to the west, all throughout the high ground. You see that the Russians are moving through with the main push towards Novohrodivka, but positional fighting is also taking place by Hrodivka and south of it and inside of it. In the southern direction, the Russians are moving entirely across the high ground, and they have not entered the low ground yet. Taking a look at Novohrodivka, the Russians have managed to break through to the center of the town, where they've managed to capture a lot of the apartment complex buildings, enter a lot of them, and slowly move through. The Russians have managed to gain a foothold in the southern outskirts of the town, along the railway to the north, and all throughout the central parts of the town, towards the central parks, apartment complexes, and general areas here within the central parts of the town, almost reaching the western outskirts of it. The Russians are here moving in throughout the western parts and central parts to gain full control over the southern parts of the town. Then they'll also enter Marinivka to the south and then push further along the western parts and the railway here to the east, but it will continue moving up in the northern direction all the way throughout the end of the town. At the same time, the Russian positions by Krychyi Yar could be used to flank the Ukrainian positions within Novohrodivka, to flank it from the north and cut it off from that direction. However, the main obstacle of the Russians for this operation is the Ukrainian high ground positions and fortified positions located in the heights here west of Hrodivka, north of Novohrodivka. In the direction of Hrodivka itself, the Russians have now gained further control over the southern parts of the town, but have managed to gain control over several forest lines and a couple of fields. This has led to them getting closer to the southern flank of Hrodivka, while they already gained full control over the eastern parts of Hrodivka. This strengthened the northern flank of Sharavka and Krychyi Yar for further offensive operations in a western direction. Moving on to the Toretsk section of the front line, there's no territorial changes. However, we do see this geolocated footage showing positional fighting here just south of the apartment complex area in the Toretsk section of the front line. This is an attempt by the Russians to move in a southern direction, gain control over the residential area here, before moving on to the government offices in the southwest and connect with the Russian positions by the second line of defense by connecting them ahead of the Dacha area. So we see that the Russians are not just moving towards the central parts of the city, but also looking to connect the two parts where the Russians have gained a foothold within the city, and where all of this connects is by this high ground Terikon hill. The Battle of Toretsk has entered the most dangerous stage for the Ukrainians, where they're facing constant Russian attacks day by day, and now that they have lost the second line of defense just east of the city, the Russians have now gained a foothold in the southern and eastern parts of it, and this has led to the Russians gaining a very strong position within Toretsk, and it is unlikely that the Ukrainians will be able to push the Russians out of the city again. This means that with the Russian foothold within the city, it is the beginning of the end of the city of Toretsk and the Ukrainian defensive positions within it. Just like the New York direction, where as soon as the Russians got a foothold, it was just the beginning of the end, and in the duration of just less than 2 months, the Russians managed to gain control over the city. And now we see that the Russians have gained a very strong foothold within Toretsk, and there's no additional fortified positions within the city itself. Moving further north in the Siversk direction, the Russians have managed to advance further in the Vyemka direction, where they are moving further along the railways in the direction of the small village. The objective is to move on towards Siversk and the high ground along the fortified positions, and to flank the Ukrainian positions southwest of Siversk. At the same time, create a position where the Russians can launch an attack along the high ground south of Vuhledar and north of Novohrodivka towards the fortified positions without having to worry about their flanks. This is why the Russians also need to push towards Vuhledar, and we may see further offensive operations in this direction. There's been a lot of positional fighting for the trenches just east of Vuhledar, where the Russians at some point this year managed to gain full control of it, but then in a counterattack they managed to lose it again, and this is due to the importance of Vuhledar and the fortified positions located on the high grounds and in the fortified positions. So we see that the Ukrainians here in Siversk direction have several fortified positions and high ground positions, which allows them to hold a very strong defense, and the Russians are slowly doing some positional fighting to improve their positions in the area. In the Kursk direction, there has been no further Ukrainian advances over the past 24 hours. Instead, the Russians have managed to recapture the rest of Spelnoe and the entirety of Burki, leaving the Ukrainians with just a single town here called Plechovo, south of the Sel River and east of it. This means that the town itself is isolated by the river lines from the other Ukrainian positions in the area. The Russians will look to gain control over Plechovo and then move on to gain control over the river line and use that as a defensive position. In the meantime, the Ukrainians are launching positional fighting just east of Sucha along the railways towards the northern flank of the Russian positions in the area. We see heavy fighting across the front line here in the Sucha direction, but the Ukrainian advances have been limited since the Russians have established their frontline positions. In the northern parts, there's been no developments either, and we see that the direction of the same river, there's been no changes either. There's been no massive offensive by the Ukrainians yet. We only see that this is the calm before the storm in the Kursk direction, as the Ukrainians are likely going to escalate the situation further. That is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon for additional content. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.